Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is David Weisberg. I am the CEO of the Federation for Jewish Philanthropy of Upper Fairfield County here on the beautiful Gold Coast of Connecticut. And I'm so delighted to have all of you joining us today for this webinar on the topic of conscious eating, the true meaning of food to table. Now, next week, we'll be celebrating the holiday of Shavuot. And Shavuot, among many things, was a time that our forefathers would parade to the temple, bringing their first fruits, their bikurim, to the temple. And when I used to be at the Isabella Friedman Jewish Retreat Center up in the Berkshires, we would recreate this traditional event every year by having a first fruits parade. And so I'm delighted to be having a webinar today that brings together the idea of fruits and farming and the Berkshires and to some extent Shavuot, with this wonderful program that will feature Elisa Spungen, Bildner, and Robert Bildner, the authors of the beautiful Berkshires Farm to Table Cookbook. So first, before we even start, I want to tell you where you can buy that cookbook, because after this program, if you haven't bought it already, I think you're going to want to get a copy of this book. And while there are plenty of places that you can buy books these days, what we've been telling folks, especially as so many of us are working so hard to make sure that our local businesses, our independent businesses, stay afloat, is to go to a place called bookshop.org. And I'm sharing a page from their website with you right now, the page with the Berkshires Farm to Table Cookbook. If you go there and buy Elisa and Robert's wonderful book, you'll make sure that you're supporting your local bookstores. So please do that at bookshop.org. I want to tell you that after the wonderful Liz Rueven interviews Elisa and Robert, we're going to have an opportunity for you to ask questions. I'm going to help moderate those questions, and there's going to be two ways to answer questions. One is to type your questions into the chat feature, which is an easy way to do that. We can read your questions for you. If you do that and you think about it, please let us know where you're writing from. The other way is to raise your virtual hand. And if you raise your virtual hand, we can actually call on you and bring you on screen with Liz and Elisa and Robert. And I want to tell you that because if you have your camera on, it means you'll actually be on screen. And so if you're someone who still hasn't changed out of your pajamas at 12:30, I want to give you the heads up before we do that. So I'd like to start our program, and I'd like to introduce our wonderful moderator, a good friend of mine, a wonderful member of our community. She is the writer and curator of a really fantastic blog called Kosher Like Me, which you can find at kosherlikeme.com. If you haven't visited yet, I would highly recommend that you do that. And so I am pleased to bring onto the screen my friend Liz Rueven. Liz, there she is.
Hi, everybody.
Liz, it's so good to see you. Thank you so much for hosting this program for us today. I can't think of anybody better to be doing it.
Thank you. Well, it's such an exciting time because, as you said, we have Shavuot coming up. We have the Westport Farmers Market opening up this coming Thursday in Westport, Connecticut, and other farmers markets opening up all over the country as crops are finally beginning to burst forward. And so it's a very exciting time for us to be speaking about Elisa and Robert's book, which I love.
I'm going to take myself off screen because nobody needs to see this punim anymore, and they'll get to see
your punim.
Yours and yours alone.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Elisa and Robert, do you want to come on screen? Elisa and Robert. Hello.
We're there. Okay.
We're here.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, everybody.
Great to be
Thanks,
in
Liz, and
Westport.
thanks, David. Really appreciate it.
We're so happy to see you, and we're really excited to be speaking about your book, especially at this time of year. So really, I love the title of your book, The Farm Table Cookbook. And I know that you have over 125 recipes in that book, which is quite the accomplishment. Would you like to start this conversation by showing us the video? It's a great introduction to your book and what it's about.
Sure, that'd be terrific. Thanks. Yeah, let's do that.
Let's do that.
In our new book, The Berkshires Farm Table Cookbook, you'll meet some of the remarkable farmers and chefs who play a heroic role in preserving the agricultural community of the area. That is, the Berkshire Hills of Western Massachusetts and neighboring New York, Vermont, and Connecticut. We tell the stories of 42 of them with personal profiles, striking photographs, and 125 kitchen-tested recipes highlighting fresh ingredients, all inspired by or created by these farmers and chefs. The story this book tells, and the recipes, offer a picture of small family farms that go well beyond this region. This area is a special place, attracting visitors from across the country. It's known for its homegrown food and farm-to-table tradition, as well as its world-class scenery and culture. The mission of our book, The Berkshires Farm Table Cookbook, is to highlight the people, places, and things that make this region so special, and the story of small family farms. The dedicated farmers and farm-to-table chefs we write about are committed to producing food that is tastier and healthier than what's often found in the supermarket by maintaining healthy soil and farming and producing food sustainably. And, as importantly, the meat farmers we interviewed are consistently concerned with treating their animals humanely.
It's tough to do this work. The farmers we interviewed are motivated to farm for environmental, social, political, health, lifestyle, and even spiritual reasons, often sacrificing a comfortable living for their values. Who could foresee when we began our journey 4 years ago to write the Berkshires Farm Table Cookbook that its mission to inspire consumers to buy local would be more important than ever when it came out in May 2020. During this time and beyond, we need to support these hardworking and principled people. Our book, website, and Facebook page suggest ways you can buy their products even now. I'm Rob Bildner.
And I'm Elisa Spungen, Bildner.
Our new cookbook, the Berkshires Farm Table Cookbook, sheds light on the farmers and the farms of the Berkshires of Western Massachusetts, Connecticut, and New York. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Elisa and Robert. That's a fantastic introduction because you show so many of the beautiful images that are in this book. And one of the things that I love so much about it is that we get a very intimate portrait of so many farmers and their families and their challenges. And I wanted to ask you, how did you choose which farmers to highlight and profile?
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'll start. Just two things though before I start. One is just the small pandemic story. That video was done by my nephew, our nephew, who's a film student in Los Angeles, because during the pandemic, there are no professional, filmmaking, et cetera. And he did a phenomenal job, and we've been really grateful to him. Second thing, just since this is a webinar, I just wanted to say just really hello to those people in Connecticut who we know who may be on, including our Machatanim. David, you started with Yiddish, so I'll just continue with Yiddish too, but Judy and Fred Block may be on as well. Anyway, Liz, I appreciate the question. We started out by working with an organization called Berkshire Grown, which pushes or advocates for small family farms in the Berkshires, and many areas all over the country have similar organizations to this, and they have a list, as do other organizations like it, of all the farms in the area, or the farms that are their members, which is a large number of the farms in the area. And we started to go through and call the farmers to go and interview them. I have to say, honestly, reaching farmers and chefs is not always easy. So even though in the video, I think, Rob, you said it took it was 4 years, multiply that a few times.
Probably 8 years.
so,
Yeah.
and we wanted to get a representative sampling of farms in different areas of the Berkshires, so that we represented North County, South County, but basically they're all small family farms. And small family farms, what's the exact definition? It's the USDA.
Well, technically, less than 125 acres and less than $100,000 in annual sales. But we also wanted a composite of meat farmers, vegetable farmers, so we wanted it to be somewhat representative. And let's not forget the farm table chefs, because we also profile farm table chefs. That's a very important message in our book.
And and you also have a cheesemaker in the book.
Yes, absolutely. We have
farmer.
two cheesemakers actually. Yeah. And I'll just say that when we would meet a farmer, we would then get directed by that farmer to another farmer, and at some point the publisher, which is Countryman Press, said, "Ganug, enough, no more. I'm the photographer. I love taking the photographs," but they said, "We just can't do more than 125 recipes. We can't have more than 42 profiles." So that kind of
we cut the book by about a quarter because we got really into it. So
it's a very, very compelling subject, and as you say in the introductory film, who could have guessed how much more compelling it would be as we've come into today's moment. And I really wanted to ask you now that, before we came on to share the screen with all of these attendees, and by the way, thank you to all of you who are listening and checking out this book. We understand that we have over 75 attendees today, and that we have viewers from all over the country, not just Connecticut and not just the Berkshires. So thank you. But I wanted to ask you, in this moment where we are heading towards hopefully emerging from the pandemic and the Berkshires region is opening back up, you mentioned that some of the major performance centers like Tanglewood and Jacob's Pillow and the Williams Theater, all of these, Williamstown Theater, all of these places are beginning to open back up. What has it been like for the growers and the restaurants during this really, really challenging time in a region that usually is so heavily populated by visitors? What has it been like in the last year?
Great question. Elisa, actually, why don't you talk about
this? So I wrote an article for the local Jewish paper on exactly this subject. We went back, Rob and I went back, and we talked to a lot of the farmers, a lot of the restaurateurs who we'd interviewed for the book to sort of, honestly, to see how they were doing. And we were plenty worried. It turns out that the farmers generally were doing pretty well. And I'll just say one thing about the farmers and then get to the chefs, because that's a little bit of a different story. So with the farmers, those who weren't selling to restaurants were doing obviously much better. Those selling to restaurants really had to turn into something different. But what's so amazing about farmers is this. Farmers have always had to be adaptable. Because of climate change, their growing season is not what it was, when to plant, when to, harvest, etc. It gets getting a little, mixed up. And that's something that every farmer commented on, that they just had to sort of go with the flow. And this was another time they had to go with the flow. Pandemic comes, all of a sudden, they really can't access their normal, customers. They had to figure out other ways to sell. So many of them started with, direct curbside pickup, really ramped up and figured out how to do it. A lot of them added to their CSAs, their community supported agriculture numbers. And so they really worked, and they were able to pivot. The chefs, a little bit tougher. Look, we all know what's happened with the restaurant world, and certainly these chefs are no different. Many of them, of course, went to takeout. Takeout does not, every one of them said, really does not cover the nut. So it's been much harder for them, and there have been some transitions in terms of restaurants. So we can think of one farm in the book that has gone out of business that we've heard of. We haven't ascertained it for sure. Otherwise, as far as we know, every single farmer is.
But also, and actually more than one restaurant that didn't make it.
Yeah.
But Liz, I think your question it's such an interesting question because we all know how horrible the pandemic was, but there was this tremendous innovation that happened. And I mentioned to you all, actually, I think I sent you guys a note about a Wall Street Journal article that was published on Sunday called Old MacDonald Has an App. And it's actually about how local farmers during this time have connected themselves with more technology to make it easier for consumers to buy from them. Because one of the problems with CSAs and some of the others is that people don't necessarily want to schlep to a farm every week and then just be told what they're going to take for that week. They want more choice. So farmers, a lot of the farmers that we write about and other local farmers are figuring out how to make it easier for people to shop their farms. So this is fascinating. We can talk more about it. But
I just, and I'm just add one thing though, because I think it's really important. Remarks that many of the farmers said, particularly for this article for the Berkshire Jewish Voice. They were thrilled actually that during the pandemic people did turn to small family farms, and it was a wonderful entree for some people who had never, dealt with small family farms, bought directly, bought CSAs, whatever. On the other hand, almost to one of these farmers said, we're worried post-pandemic when everything is back to normal, that all of a sudden this really cute, I forgot how did Dominic say it? Groovy.
If you don't come back to us, you won't have that groovy local farm that you were shopping during the pandemic. So they're worried that people won't make this more of a permanent
habit.
Yeah.
Well, that's right. And we're all really speaking about that. What are the changes that we've adapted and adopted during this time that we should really make a part of our regular behaviors? And I know that here in the Westport, Connecticut area, I mean, people were going up to farms and understanding the true meaning of we're going to buy what's available. I mean, there was nothing in season because it was March, but then things came into season. But I think that it illuminated the idea of seasonal eating for a lot of people, because once they went up to a farm and they saw a huge selection, let's say it were today, of greens, the early spring crops, they understood that, we don't want to risk going to a supermarket to buy tomatoes. And maybe we shouldn't be eating tomatoes anyway when they're not in season.
Or berries.
I'm just hoping, like that farmer and like anyone else who really is concerned with supporting the local food system, that people integrate this. And I hope that people tasted the difference, because, I think that in the end, that's part of the message also, is that when you buy from your local farmer, you're supporting the whole ecosystem, and you're also getting better product in your kitchen. So your food will be better, and it will be simpler, and it will require less technique and less preparation. We picked greens from our garden last night, and there was very little because I had already done like a big pick of stuff for Mother's Day. But what we threw in the wok, including some very early arugula that were just like teeny tiny leaves at the very end, and some scallions that have popped back up, and a little bit of greens. My husband turned to me and he said, "This is the most delicious thing. You made something out of nothing." But if you're growing it, or if you're supporting your local farms, that's the way your food will taste. Yeah. What I wanted to ask you, you use the words that I think cause a great deal of confusion for some people. The words like sustainable, local, organic. I know that some people go even to a traditional market and say, I see that this, this vegetable is labeled local. Well, first of all, I want to know how local, but second of all, am I better off buying it because it's local, because it's not organic? Like, how do people navigate? How do you navigate this confusing use of terms?
Sure. Yeah, I'll start, and then Elisa will.
Yeah, we made different views.
So in my previous life, when I ran a kind of globally sourced produce distribution company, I was on the New Jersey Organic Certification Board, part of that system. Organic is simply a bunch of regulations that are laid out by the government. Now it's the federal government, it used to be the states. And it basically, the theory is it's better to not have, quote, artificially developed chemicals used on the farm. That's kind of it. In practice, there are thousands and thousands of chemicals that the certification boards look at, and sometimes I wonder really how different are they from. But that's what organic is, to be honest. It's a certification, and when we have a choice between just buying anything at a supermarket and organic, we will normally gravitate to organic. Local is local. Local is the farm that is in your area. We always say buy local, but know your farmer. Know who's growing the local. Sustainable is much broader. Sustainable, it has to do with a farmer who really cares about the environment, about the way they treat their animals, about basically having a community that they are engaged in, that supports them. So it's a much broader definition. So Lisa, I know you want to talk about sustainability.
I'm happy to discuss it. There's also another word that I would throw into the pile, which is regenerative agriculture. And that's sort of the latest word in agriculture. And that means not just to stay sustainable, not just keeping the earth, the environment in as good a situation as you found it, but actually making it better. So, for example, there are some pig farmers that we have a profile of in our book, and they get very annoyed if you say that their pigs are pasture raised, because they say, what does pasture raised mean? The pasture's what it is. If we aren't doing something to make that pasture better than what we found it, regenerative, then there's nothing great about it. But I want to go back to the issue of local, because one of the things people say is, well, I don't live by farms, how do I do local?
Yes.
I might be able to do in the Berkshires, whatever it may be. The truth of the matter is local, I mean, you said you mean your local farms, but technically local really can mean the whole area surrounding where you are that would be needed to supply the food for that area, the food shed, so to speak. And so New York City local would mean, I think it's 200 miles around New York City would be considered local, which, by the way, would include the Berkshires.
Yes.
And ditto for Westport, ditto for, Fairfield, ditto for, all the Connecticut towns that you guys encompass. So I don't think people should be put off by, oh my God, I'm not by a farm. There's a big difference between that and buying from California. Yeah, go on, you're going to say something.
Well, no, I was going to say there's a lot of pressure now, I think, on the supermarkets to label not just with the word local, but where it's coming from. So when I see Jersey corn, if it's come in before Connecticut corn, I consider it local. If I then have a choice, I'll buy Connecticut. But what I really wanted to talk about also is the use of the word organic, because I think that really gets people caught. And Rob, you mentioned something that's so important, and I use this in my social media all the time. I use the hashtag Know Your Farmer. So if you have the opportunity to visit the farms or to even Google the farms that are supplying some of your supermarkets, or better, if you can, to shop the farmers markets, if they don't have a certification that says organic, it does not mean that they are not caring for their land. It does not mean that they are using destructive chemicals. Many of them are regenerative farmers and they care very, very much. They can't afford the certification.
That's excellent. I was actually going to make that point myself. When I was on the organic certification board, many farmers would say to me, look, we're doing everything right. We're not using anything different than our neighbor who's certified, but I can't afford, I think at the time it was almost $500, maybe now it's $1,000. Many of the farmers we wrote about in our book are not certified organic, but I will tell you, their farms are pristine. They are sustainable. You can you can eat their soil. I mean, it's just so healthy, nutritious. So totally. It doesn't mean that we should not buy their products. We need to know who they are, and that's the point.
Right. And interestingly enough, farmers and growers are happy to be in conversation with people who bother to ask the questions. And I know that it feels intimidating to some people at a farmer's market, especially if there are people behind you online, to say, you can't really open up this whole conversation with someone who's on the other side of the table selling you their broccoli. But when you have the opportunity, and you may learn, or people may learn, it may be very early in the morning, or it may be a half an hour before closing time, you can have conversations with these growers. They want to speak about how they grow because they care about how they grow.
This is, we were so impressed by the growers we met and their commitment to the soil, their passion for what they do. They're not making a lot of money. They really are not. That's a whole other issue. Why are locally grown goods the cost they are? That's what it costs. But you're absolutely spot on. We need to know who they are and why they do what they do. And yeah,
I was going to say there's one particular farmer. We were speaking about this actually before the program started. Cricket Creek. He's a cheesemaker.
Cheese, yeah.
Yes.
And he said to us that he sells beyond the Berkshires in the Northeast. And he says he's absolutely thrilled when he gets notes, and he does all the time, from people saying, how do you treat your cows? He said, and he agrees, just ask. Farmers are more than happy. They're ideological. They are very proud of what they're doing. They'll be more than happy to tell you how they're treating their animals, how they're treating their soil, how they're treating all the components of the farm.
And Liz, I'll just say, the question you ask is asked of us at every book talk. Right. It's the difference between local, sustainable, or there's even another category, biodynamic, which takes things to maybe a little, as our kids in California say, woo-woo level about, planting during the full moon. You can get crazy, but anyway.
Well, before we continue talking about farmers and the issues, because we could speak for hours about that, I was wondering if we could look at some images of some of your favorite recipes.
Yeah, great. Let's talk about food.
Yeah. Can you cue, because I want people to buy your book. I want them to be excited about the stories and the recipes. Let's take a look.
Okay, as we say, this is a cookbook. we get caught up in the farm. All right, so
you want to start?
Yeah, because this is actually one of my favorite recipes. I made it last weekend. It really is inspired by one of our local shiitake mushroom growers and one of our local goat cheese producers. Wonderful farmers, and it's a lot of fun. This is so flavorful. The shiitake mushroom frittata. I highly recommend it. Lisa's the chef in our family, but I can make this
Rob
one,
can cook.
and it was every crowd pleaser. So highly recommend. All of our recipes are inspired by what the farmers we met grow and raise. So and we've attached the names of the farms to the recipe. So if you ever want to visit them, you'll know that this is from Deerfield Farms, for example, in Rawson Brook Cheese Farm.
You might want to mention that the farmer who grows the shiitake mushrooms that inspired this recipe is actually a logger, and he just on his own figured out how to make shiitake mushrooms with his logs lying around. And
on his own with an extension course from the University of Massachusetts.
It's online. They're phenomenal shiitakes. Right. The one thing I do want to say about this, though, is one of the principles of our book is this, which is, recipes are really a canvas for what you want to paint. And it's going to be your choice of ingredients as well as obviously colors if you're painting. And, yes, we say it's a shiitake mushroom frittata, but we all know you can put anything you want into a frittata. So again, the idea is to be flexible. If you don't have shiitake mushrooms or you don't like them, there are many other things you could put in.
And the same thing with these beautiful greens. It could be anything.
Absolutely.
Totally.
Let's see more. Show us more.
Next. Let's see the next.
Okay. So, so one of the things, I think you said this at the beginning, Liz, there's nothing like eating lettuce or greens that are from your garden or from that are locally produced. There's actually a taste to them. They don't have that sort of bland, like cardboard, whatever. Frisee, arugula have their own particular taste. And one of the things wonderful about the salad is we have a maple Dijon dressing that is what's used on this salad. And the sweetness of the maple Dijon really complements and works well with the more, I'm going to say bitterish taste tart taste of arugula, frisee, etc. So, but again, these lettuces, the lettuces you buy locally, are the ones or greens have taste. You want to go to the next one?
Next.
Okay. Since this is probably predominantly a Jewish crowd, let's talk latkes. So we have two latke recipes, one for rutabaga latkes and one for savory beet latkes. Again, latkes are another canvas. You can put lots of different things in latkes. We chose rutabagas and beets. And by the way, rutabagas are one of those vegetables that people sort of see in supermarkets and usually walk by because I don't know what to do with them. There are plenty of things to do with rutabagas and kohlrabi and all kinds of stuff. So don't get nervous if you see these vegetables. So beet latkes. The one thing I'll say about the beet latkes and latkes generally, and I'm sure there are a lot of really phenomenal latke makers who are online right now. If you want really good latkes, two things I'd say. One, make sure you really, after you grate the vegetables, and I do this all in a food processor. I used to not, but I was tired of getting my hands, totally wrecked from grating my hands. But once you grate them, you really have to take all the moisture out. Make them really dry. When you start frying them, I really don't fry them. I use very, very little oil. The second thing is also don't put them it's really tempting to stack them in the pan so you can get as many done in one batch. But what happens is you end up sort of steaming them and you get sort of like a little bit of a gloppy, mushy mess. So you want to do a few at a time so that they have their space. Anything you want to say?
Nope.
Okay.
With the applesauce.
Oh yeah,
Applesauce. Elisa loves to make applesauce from the apples we pick in the fall, which we tend to store. And I think it's one of your favorite
I just
pastimes, making
yeah.
applesauce, sometimes during Zoom calls.
I'm always, don't look, but underneath Zoom calls, I'm always peeling apples. We have bushels and bushels we keep in our refrigerators, in our garage.
All right.
And I will say you can pick apples at the beginning of the season. And that, by the way, you pick stuff is another way to do local. But you can keep apples for a long period of time if you wrap them in newspaper or keep them separated out from each other in a refrigerator. They can last months.
Yeah. Next
would be great.
Let's look at the next.
Whole wheat penny. The reason that I thought might be nice to show this is because this is a lovely dish that uses asparagus, and we're now coming into asparagus season. Hopefully you can see that in the picture. Again, you could probably sub anything you want. I'll just mention with asparagus, for those who are less familiar with asparagus, you cut them at the bottom, take off the white part, it snaps off really easily. These are very, very crisp asparagus, and it's just a wonderful spring dish. But I make it all year long, just sub in other things.
Yeah, and I think we're going to distribute this recipe to the participants.
Yeah. And one other thing I'll mention, I'm a nutritionist as well in terms of background, and I'm really sort of adamant about, I really don't like to use white pasta. I use whole wheat. I'll use bean pasta. This particular pasta, I think, is a sfoglini, which is a wonderful pasta from Brooklyn. They did not pay me to say that. It just happens to be really nice whole wheat pasta.
I wanted to mention something about asparagus because there are two things that occurred to me recently. One is we always served asparagus at Passover, and it didn't occur to me until I really started writing and exploring about food and asparagus that it is an early spring crop. So that's why, for some people in America, they pop into Pesach menus as a great seasonal green. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that it takes, I think, 3 years before you can harvest your first asparagus stalks. And they last, they're perennial, well, not, but they last for about 18 to 20 years. But they are, if you've ever seen asparagus growing, and I would recommend if you're interested and you can go to a farm where you can see them growing, it's really fascinating because we're talking about one stalk at a time. So when you see a bunch of asparagus and you look at the price and you say, oh my, that is really expensive, that's the reason why. Yeah. It takes a long time to grow them and they are not that plentiful once they're growing.
I learned something, that's great.
Yeah, thanks, yeah.
Glad you mentioned it.
Next slide. Let's look at one more, two. All right.
This might be then. So I just put this on because this happens to be, and I want to talk a little bit about local dairy. This happens to be just a super easy dessert. We're talking 10 minutes to make it, 10, 15 minutes max, ganache. But what makes this, and why this is out, what makes this so good is, hold on.
We also the blueberry bread. Also.
Oh, okay. Yeah, somebody just sent me a note. So what makes this so good when you do local is if you buy from a local dairy, you will find that the dairy products are very different from, the sort of very commercial dairy products that you find. So this uses heavy whipping cream or heavy cream, which is different from light whipping cream and whipping cream. And it's because it's local, it's not ultra pasteurized. It doesn't have to last as long. It's just pasteurized. And the flavor is different. If you compare, an ultra and a pasteurized, you find something very different. And I'll just mention something briefly about chocolate. Again, you do it any way you want. This is made with dark chocolate. which I think is a guaranteed, it has to be 35% cocoa solids. So it's not milk chocolate, but you can use, any kind of chocolate you want, whatever variation. I happen to make these. Let's see. I also put it says cranberries, but I actually use wild Maine blueberries or wild dried blueberries, and they're delicious. It just gives it a really interesting texture.
That is fantastic. I love all of these, and I will add that my favorite recipe, or the recipe that I'm about to make coming right up, is your rhubarb compote. Because when rhubarb hits the farmers markets or a supermarket, that's another baffling vegetable. It is a vegetable for people to handle. And you have a recipe in here that includes has less sugar and an equal part of maple syrup. And you've got that sweet savory thing going on with ginger and onion. And it's a true compote, so it's chunky and it sounds delicious. So for anyone who's wondering, what should I do with this rhubarb that I'm seeing, there's a rhubarb compote recipe here. And I'm wondering at this time if there's anyone in the audience. We've talked a lot, but there's always more to say, but do we have any questions out there?
We do. Give me just one moment and I'm going to ask Judy to join us on screen. I know Judy has a question. So Judy, I've asked you to start your video and unmute yourself when you join us.
That's our
Hi, Judy Block.
our market.
Hi, can you see me?
No, I can't see you.
There
Yes,
you
hi.
are.
Judy
There
Block.
you All right. The wonderful thing about knowing your family is to learn about the fact that food is a multi-generational passion. Rob, from your father to you and to your sons, Rafi, who has now a pizza a van going through the Berkshires with using these wonderful fresh produce, and your son, my son-in-law, Ari, who is passionate about wine. My question to you is, with the farmers that you met, do you see their businesses being passed on from generation to generation, or is it more limited?
Yeah, it's a great question, Judy. And by the way, I do want to acknowledge my grandfather, blessed memory, who really was the beginning of this chain, at least in America. But his father in the old country was a peddler of fruit and vegetables. So we go on many generations in our family food business, now culminating with your son-in-law, my son Ari, and our son Rafi. It's a great question. In our travels, my travels around the country, when I operated my kind of national produce distribution company, I met farmers all over. And farming is really, really hard, harder than ever. Every year it gets harder. So many younger people are not going into farming. And that is a national, I'd say it's a national threat, if you will, to our food supply. You know, it's compensated a little bit because agribusiness is getting bigger and bigger. It's getting more automated. So, but at some point, there are regions of the country that do not have enough farmers. So in the Berkshires, we find there are some multi-generational families, but I would say farm families, but less so. And a lot of the farmers that we interviewed are actually new farmers. They've come into this field from other professions because of their passion. It's really interesting. A lot of younger people, like our son Rafi, actually, who's really committed to farming. And so they're almost having to learn something that historically was passed on generation to generation. And there are organizations that are actually helping to make up for this lack of generational knowledge or education, that actually have training seminars, mentors, apprenticeships to teach them. It's a great question.
I think the average age of farmers is said to be 60 years old, which is
62.
It's really a problem. Again, to go back to sort of the beginning, and Judy, I'm really glad you asked this. To go back to sort of the beginning of our conversation, this is why it's so important to support local farmers. There's many, many reasons, but they are up against the tide of big ag. It's ironic. Rob and I just came back from a road trip visiting my family in Chicago, and we drove out there and drove back, and we drove through, particularly in Ohio, just, vast farmland.
In Indiana.
In Indiana as well. And again, the difference between those farms and these small family farms is
It's massive.
tremendous in terms of effect on the environment and effect on the community, nutrition, really along every single, variable. And so, when you find, or when there are people who are willing to start these small family farms, we should support them, and hopefully they will find the information that they need to do, make it happen.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks, Judy.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, I have a question from Casey, who I don't think is in Kansas City, but it's from Casey. And Casey says, it's an important question. This discussion is much more necessary to address today, but so often at-risk neighborhoods do not have the access to these foods.
Sure.
What steps, if any, have farms made towards getting their food out to these neighborhoods?
Great question. Also a question that's been asked of us all over the country. So we begin with the first statement is locally grown foods are not expensive because these farmers are making a killing or anything. It's what it costs. The amount of time to be sustainable, to not use agricultural chemicals that are easily bought at the local, farm store and just sprayed all over. That's not what our farmers are doing, and treating their animals humanely, and on and on. So it just costs more to compared to the food we can buy in the supermarket, which also we have to acknowledge gets tremendous subsidies from the government. Big agribusiness, they're getting, and it's been in the papers over this year, hundreds of millions of dollars of subsidies. Also for water, the irrigation that's used in California to irrigate these massive farms. So one, our farmers have very high costs because that's what it costs. Two, the so-called conventional food supply is actually heavily subsidized, but it's not healthy, nutritious. So what do we do about that? So number of our farmers, I would say most of them are very aware of it and are trying to do something in their own way. One of our farms that we profile is Hawthorne Valley Farms in New York. They actually have consciously set up their own farm store in Hudson, which is a lower income community in many aspects, to make it possible for people who don't have the means to buy locally grown food at a price they can afford. And that's just part of their mission. They're doing that. Other farms are contributing to their local food banks and doing what they can to make it possible for people who can't afford to buy their food in a store to buy it. There's also a move afoot, I would say, and people are very aware of locating the farmers markets in so-called disadvantaged communities, bringing the farm closer to the communities. That's happening. And then finally, I'll just conclude on this point that if we can get locally grown foods in our school systems, in our school lunch programs, that would be a tremendous help, both for the farmers and for our children, to give them just healthier, more nutritious foods that are really, in the end of the day, really helping support the community. So it's a great question. There are organizations, there's one called Roots Rising in our community that actually subsidizes locally grown food baskets for families who've been impacted by the pandemic. And it's going, and of course the food banks are doing whatever they can. So
I also would just add that sometimes when you buy a CSA, and I just probably should define CSA because just in case people aren't familiar with it, it's community supported agriculture. You buy a share of what the farm is going to produce before the season begins. So you're giving the farm capital to work from, and in return you get every week or every 2 weeks or whatever you sign up for, that farm's produce or whatever they're offering to you. But many of them will set aside or take or add to the price of a CSA, and then have CSAs for people who otherwise can't afford them,
including the one we participate, which is Woven Roots in Tyringham, Massachusetts. That's what they do.
But we have a question from my friend Allison, who I know to be a master gardener. And Allison asks, were any of the farmers you met with using drip irrigation, drones, or other Israeli agri-technologies?
Ooh, I don't remember any.
To be honest, our farmers are, I'm trying to think, the largest farm would not.
Would be the dairy farm. Highline.
Yeah, Highline.
Yeah, they're really small. I mean, these farms are really, we're talking sometimes
Small.
1 acre, 2 acre, 3 acres. So the answer is we haven't seen it. And somebody may have used
Drip
little
irrigation, yeah, I
Yeah.
can think of some farms that were, but not drones. And they're not at that level.
I mean, these are farms, just so you know, many of these farmers are literally doing everything by hand. Again, part of the reason is because they're very concerned with the soil, very concerned with, being as, true to their principles as possible. So most of the farms, for example, are, I should say most, but many are hand tilled. Literally, they barely are turning over the soil because they want to keep the soil undisturbed so that carbon stays in, doesn't go in the atmosphere, which I know is not totally your question, but this is the level of farming that we're talking about.
If, David, if we don't have any other questions, I have a question.
Well, we do, but we always have space for your questions too, Liz.
Well, no, let's hear from our viewers first, because I want to know what's on everyone else's mind.
I have a question from Stacy, wanting to know what motivates young farmers to farm. Is it that there's a field passed down from generation to generation, or are we seeing an uptick in young farmers starting to farm? And I would add to that, and how are they learning the art?
Well, okay, so that's in a way we write in the book, In fact, I think we may have even said that in the video. They're motivated for, spiritual, ideological, environmental reasons, family reasons. Many of our farmers, younger farmers, have told us they just think it's a better place to raise their family. And I have to say, we've met these kids over the years. We've seen them grow, and their independence is pretty impressive if I compare it to the kids who grow up in the suburbs. I mean, they learn to, drive a tractor when they're, 7 years old or 8 years old. They're really fiercely independent. So they really like the lifestyle. I mean, that is a big compelling issue.
So a number of the farmers that we spoke to were really moved by Back to the Landers, the whole Back to the Land movement, and the organic movement. Elliot Coleman, Scott and Helen Nearing. So they were moved to, they read about it. I'm thinking of one farm in particular called Hawk Dance in New York State. The New York State, Hillsdale, New York. The owners of the farm, a husband and wife team, were living in Queens, New York. They were really moved, again, very ideologically moved by the writings of Back to the Land people. And they literally picked up, she was a vet tech and had a pet sitting business. He was, I think, a house painter. And they literally picked up and moved upstate New York. They learned how to farm first. I mean, it's not that they just started with absolutely nothing. They apprenticed, or he apprenticed himself in terms of learning to farm with another farmer. That's what really motivated them to do it. And they farm, I think, 3 acres, mostly by hand.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
I wanted to make a suggestion to everyone on this call, and to let you know something that I do, and I know a lot of people who do this also. When you head out, whether it's for a day trip or if you're traveling for a weekend to the Berkshires or wherever you're going, pack a cooler, throw some coolers in your cooler. And when you see farm stands, or when you see notices that farmers markets are coming up on the weekend or during the week or whatever, try really hard to support them, because there's a whole spiral of things that happens as a result of that. You bring home better food, you've supported the local economy, and you may get really turned on to shopping more locally in your own community if you don't already. But, it's kind of like putting your phone in your car, your water bottle in your car, throw a cooler in your car with coolers inside. And when you see these opportunities, try to stop and speak to people about where you are and what you're buying, and support them.
That's a great suggestion. And I'll say that, Liz, we're foodies. We do that all the time. So we took a day trip, for example, to Pioneer Valley, outside of, all the farms outside of Northampton and so forth. And they're wonderful little farm stores with a great cheese and, locally grown vegetables. And we just have fun, just buying it. It reminds me of when we're traveling in Europe, within Italy or France, and stopping, these little specialty stores and picking up the freshest food. We can do that here. We can do this in Connecticut.
It's a great outing. It was honestly, it was a great pandemic outing. We used to do it all the time.
Yeah.
And again, you can get maps of all the farms in the area from these organizations that represent farmers or
Yeah.
advocate for farmers, and they usually, you can literally go one by one. Often helpful to call in advance. Farmers generally are not wild about people just, showing
Yeah, I
up
mean,
if they don't have a farm stand.
go to their farm store. But Berkshire Grown has an online directory, lists all the farms.
Right.
Go to our website, berkshiresandbeyond.com. We have a map of where all our farms are located. So what a great idea, Liz.
CISA and Pioneer Valley.
So Liz, I have a question from Shoshana in Philadelphia who wants to ask Robert and Elisa, do you have a sense of how this book is helping to introduce the Berkshires to people around the country who may be completely unfamiliar with what and where the Berkshires are?
Yeah, what a great question. We were talking about that before we came on.
So
Yeah,
I would
yeah.
answer by saying, first of all, I really appreciate the question, and it sounds like you have an interest in the Berkshires in particular. We've actually spoken all over the country, so we've had to sort of define the Berkshires to people who absolutely have nothing about New England, and that's been sort of a fun thing to do, and we can certainly speak about that as well. But one of the things I did want to say is, although the book is about the Berkshires, it's really very universal. It's about small family farms wherever they may be. Their products might be slightly different depending. We've spent some time in South Florida looking at small family farms. Their products are not the same, obviously, as the ones here. But the point is, they really are very similar, even though specifically we are talking about the Berkshires. Did you want to talk
Yeah,
about
but I
Berkshires?
would say specific to the Berkshires, we've actually been shocked by, I mentioned we did a speech for the Rhode Island Federation yesterday. There were people on that call who had never been to the Berkshires. So, and people in Boston, we've done talks for groups in Boston. So we on our website, I only mention it because we list the cultural attractions. We list the recreational opportunities, the hiking, the biking. We have a lot of what I call touristic information on our website. And we really make the point that the Berkshires is known a lot in New York, let's say in Boston, as a cultural and Westport institution destination with Tanglewood and everything that's opening up. But we're trying to bring out kind of the hidden food hub, which is the Berkshires as well. But it's we like to think of ourselves as ambassadors for this region, and it's been interesting. It's great.
Liz, I have one last question, and it's from me. It's from David, and especially as we approach Shavuot, which is a time of revelation. And this is not a Jewish cookbook; it's a universal cookbook. But is there something in your neshama, in your Jewish soul, that spoke to you and said, these are things we care about, and these are things we want to write about?
So the answer is very much yes. We did, again, this wasn't a Jewish cookbook, and it wasn't a kosher cookbook, although I'd say most of the recipes can at least be made vegetarian, because that's been our inclination. That being said, though, we feel very strongly, and we got into this more as we did the cookbook, that really supporting small family farms is a quintessentially Jewish act. The values of these farmers are values that we as Jews should espouse and act on as well. So, for example, we mentioned that the way that animals are, the way that most of the farmers, I would say all the farmers who raised animals that we met and talked to, cared for their animals in a way that is consonant with Jewish ideas, tsa'ar ba'alei chayim, how you treat your animals. And while, in, I think, Genesis, humans are given dominion over animals, the truth of the matter is there are many restrictions within Jewish text about how animals have to be treated. So to me, it's a very Jewish thing to be a small family farmer, raising animals and treating them the way that they raised it. And I would say ditto for the environment. Do you want to talk about the environment?
Yeah, so Baal Tashchit, which is a Jewish principle about do not destroy. Many Jewish environmentalists, that's kind of their maxim. And we find that so many of our farmers, are, as we've talked about, are so conscious about sustainability, about protecting the environment. And there are many, many Jewish texts which talk about how it's essential to have a garden or to be, you may know some of these, Liz. So as Elisa says, while and I'll just say there is a history of Jewish farming in the Berkshires too, which is really interesting. We actually have a book that our local federation published a while back about Jewish chicken farmers. But anyway, as we say, we feel that buying local, knowing a farmer is quintessentially a Jewish act, and totally appropriate for the holiday Shavuot as we're thinking about that
And there's
revelation.
plenty of dairy recipes too
Yeah.
while we're on the
Yeah.
subject.
Yeah.
David, that was a great question. And that's a great way, I think, for us to complete the circle and thank Elisa and Robert for this beautiful book and for the wonderful collection of recipes and very, very compelling stories about individuals and their families and how they're growing in your beautiful region. And before we close, or David's going to close, I just wanted to thank New Haven and Eastern Connecticut Federations for joining us today. We really love collaborating with any of our neighbors, and we really appreciate your joining us.
We just want to thank you too.
Yeah.
Thank you, Liz. Thank you, David. And I know Stacy's behind
Yeah.
the scenes. Really
We've
appreciate
had
it.
so
It's
much
been
fun.
wonderful to work with. Thanks
You
so
guys-
much.
You guys are pros. Thank you.
You had some-
Thank all of you. And I also want to echo Liz in thanking our friends in New Haven and Eastern Connecticut Federations, and also friends tuning in Washington State and Georgia and Arizona and Florida. It's so great to have you be a part of this. And we certainly hope you will come visit our community and visit the Berkshires and take your little cooler along with you
Yeah.
as well.
Cooler.
The coolers.
Liz, Robert, Elisa, I'm so delighted and thrilled that we were able to have this program and share it with all of our friends here.
Yeah. Chag Sameach.
Thanks so much.
Thank
Enjoy,
you.
enjoy
Chag
that.
Sameach. And I just want to say, in addition to talking about, wonderful and fresh and organic food, I'm so glad we had the opportunity to speak a little bit about food insecurity as well, which is something that's really risen to the surface in our community. And I'm so proud of our federation and our community for having recently raised the funds to fund the entire first-year operations of a new kosher food pantry in Bridgeport.
Wow.
And
That's
really exciting, a new mobile food pantry that will be launched in the fall that will drive around our community, providing food to those who need it. That's also part of our ecosystem.
Totally.
Is how we all work together to support each other. And so in this time of revelation in the weeks to come, I hope that these will be all part of the learning that we have as we grow together individually and as a Jewish community. Liz, thank you so much for hosting. I couldn't think of a better moderator for this conversation. Robert and Elisa, thank you for sharing your book and your wonderful stories with us. And to all of our friends, we wish you a Chag Shavuot Sameach, and we look forward to joining you on future programs, not only on Zoom, but we pray soon in person. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a beautiful day.
Thank you.
Great to see you all. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.